In the next 6 months, if the sanctions stay in place and there's tightened enforcement, like the steps that David Lammy has taken, the steps that the Biden administration has just taken against Gazprom Bank, that it will put huge pressure on the Russian economy, whether or not it would cause him to pull back from the war. But he's facing a huge labor shortage, a massive recruitment challenge. I mean, the losses on the front for Russia are enormous and are about double the recruitment rate. I mean, he needs to recruit at least 500,000 soldiers in the next year, and I don't see how he's going to do that.
This week, the Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, announced more sanctions against Russia, targeting its shadow fleet of ships transporting Russian oil, which generates billions for Putin's state. Nevertheless, in the last month, the Russian army has made its biggest territorial gains in Ukraine since the early days of the invasion, gaining an area half the size of London. So how can this be happening with all these sanctions? How effective are these sanctions at limiting Russia's power? And how will UK and US relations with Putin unfold? Well, Stephanie Baker, veteran Bloomberg reporter who spent decades covering Russia, addresses these questions and the story of the economic war in Russia in her book, Punishing Putin, Inside the Global Economic War to Bring Russia Down. And Stephanie joins me now. Welcome to Times Radio.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. Look, when Russia first invaded Ukraine, or at least when the war kicked up, the UK and allies set about booting out Russian oligarchs, seizing Russian assets, expelling diplomats. Did none of it have any effect?
Right. So the issue with sanctions is they don't work overnight, and they aren't meant to work in isolation. Mm-hmm. They were meant to accompany military aid to Ukraine. Now, arguably, the sanctions, although they were unprecedented in scope soon after Russia invaded, they were rolled out too slowly to have a massive impact overnight. You did see the Russian economy wobble in that first month, and then it recovered on the back of record oil revenues. What you're seeing now is the pressure from sanctions finally beginning to build. The U.S. administration has rolled out additional sanctions as well against Gazprom Bank, which had been left alone in order to enable gas payments to certain European countries that were still importing Russian gas. But that has caused a bit of an economic crisis in Russia right now. You see the ruble at 108. It's one of the weakest currencies in the world. And you see inflation incredibly high, partly as a result of the sanctions causing imports to be more expensive, as well as the record defense spending that Putin has rolled out. And I think that the issue is Russia is facing headwinds, serious headwinds right now. The sanctions are beginning to have an effect. Just at a time when Trump is coming in and promising to end the war in a day. And, there's some that are concerned that perhaps in order to do a ceasefire deal, he may dangle limited sanctions relief to entice Putin to the table. And just when the sanctions are about to have an impact.
Just when they're starting to bite. Well, we'll come to the situation now in just a moment. But going back a bit to when these sanctions began, is there an argument that they backfired because they sort of pushed up energy prices and Russia simply sold this energy elsewhere?
Well, remember, in the first year, until December 2022, oil had not been touched by sanctions. Right. And then they rolled out this wonky plan called the price cap to impose a cap on the price of Russian oil. And the EU embargo came into place. The record price of oil was on the back of concerns about Russian supply and some people steering clear. And yes, ironically, Putin profited from the very war he started. Wars do create concerns about supply. And I do argue in this book that oil is the mainstay of the Russian economy. Oil is key here. That the weakness that the Soviet Union experienced in the 80s was due to a falling global price of oil. The relatively low price of oil in the 1990s was one of the things that hobbled Yeltsin's reform efforts. And Putin has been pretty lucky with a rising price of, relatively high price of oil during his rule. And that the way to really hit Russian revenues and Russia's ability to sustain the war is by going after oil revenues. And you do see oil coming down, softening demand in China and the like. I go into the backstory and try to tell the policy, the evolution of policy through characters, the people that were involved, both in the U.S. and the U.K. and Europe, to try to make it more accessible so that people can understand how this war unfolded and how difficult it is. I mean, this, in many respects, it was a grand experiment because they'd never imposed sanctions on such a large economy like Russia and one that was so globally integrated.
Let's talk a little bit about oligarchs and the impact there. Because when the sanctions began, the Conservative government initially posted pictures of various oligarchs with the word "sanction" written across them like a sort of Hollywood wanted sign. How was that? I guess two questions. Firstly, what was the point there? Was the point there to make these people pressurize Putin with the idea that they might have influence over him? And secondly, how was it viewed in Russia that had happened?
Look, some people thought, perhaps naively, that they might turn on Putin because they had their toys taken away from them.
This was said a lot, yeah.
Right. I think the people who really knew the way Russia works realize that that is not really going to happen. And I think in the UK's case, Londongrad had been awash with Russian money for so long. There had been calls for years to clean up dirty money in the city of London. And so many Russian oligarchs had owned property here, had used it as their base, that time was overdue for a change and for a cleanup. And that it was untenable to have some of Russia's richest men using London as their base as Russia was waging war on Ukraine. So this was an attempt to go after some of the Russian elite, to impose costs, to make them realize that this was no longer business as usual. It was, of course, on one level, a populist push because there were people demanding this, that we can't continue to allow dirty Russian money to run amok in London. The effect of those has been somewhat mixed. Yes, Londongrad is largely over. There still is Russian money underneath the surface going through London.
Tell us a bit about some of those people, some of those oligarchs, and the steps they took to protect their money when these sanctions were coming at them.
Well, for instance, you had Roman Abramovich, the owner of Chelsea, who was forced to sell Chelsea as a result of the sanctions. He was accused by the U.S. government of having reshuffled his assets right before the war began, transferring planes and his super yachts and other assets to his children. He had denied that this was, in anticipation of the war beginning and sanctions perhaps coming down the pike. He couldn't do that with Chelsea. You can't just transfer the ownership of a Premier League club to someone else without checks and procedures going through. So some of them were caught unaware. I go in the book, in addition to the story of Abramovich and what happened to the money that was the proceeds of Chelsea, I go into another Russian oligarch called Mikhail Friedman, who owns a mansion in Hampstead and was caught unaware. Many of them were not anticipating this invasion and had not made preparations to shuffle their assets. And he was caught with billions frozen in the West and no plan B, so to speak, and stayed in the UK for 18 months fighting the sanctions. His home was, I go into this in the book, was raided by the NCA, and they bungled the raid, and he sued them and won damages and eventually left London.
Yeah. I mean, so look, coming back to the now, while I've got you, what do you expect to happen then with Donald Trump? Do you think he is likely, as you said, to dangle the carrot of reducing sanctions in order to secure a deal? And do you think if he wasn't coming in, if he wasn't about to do that, actually these sanctions really would begin to bite and really would pressurize Russia to end the conflict?
I think that, and this is why Russia has turned to North Korea for troops. So it does. Trump has said he wants to end the war in a day. How do you do that? Putin has not changed his objectives of controlling all of Ukraine. He wants a neutral, demilitarized, denazified, as he calls it, Ukraine. And I don't see how he's going to agree to a deal when the Russian army is on the up and, they're slowly gaining territory. Why he would stop at this point without some sort of carrot dangled and sanctions relief. Now, the flip side to that is if Trump and his advisors sit down and try to do a deal with Putin and they realize how difficult it is, Ukraine is occupying this part of Russia, Kursk. What do they do with that? How does that get traded in any kind of deal? If he realizes that Putin's not willing to do a deal, they could, this is an optimistic scenario, they could decide to do the opposite and tighten sanctions and perhaps provide additional military aid to Ukraine. Most of the people around Trump that he's nominated are China hawks. Yeah. And they view that we cannot be focused on Ukraine and China. We need to shift our focus to the main threat against what they see as the main threat against the U.S., which is China. And the U.S. defense industrial base is just not equipped to fight two wars in two arenas. And that is the thing that concerns many. I mean, Trump has appointed some, more Bush, Reagan era type people around him. His national security advisor, Mike Waltz, is of that ilk rather than a sort of traditional MAGA Republican. But he did vote against Ukraine aid in the most recent round earlier this year. So that does not bode well for Ukraine's future.
Finally, Stephanie, big picture in Russia. Look, you, having worked in Russia as a business reporter and seeing what you call the narrative arc there, the fall of communism, the failure of the rise of democracy, the failure of democracy, the rise of Putin's authoritarianism. What happens next?
I'd be a fool to try to predict what happens next in the Kremlin. Look, I do try to go into that in the book for people who want to get sort of a crash course in the rise of Putin and the Russian economy. You can see, his vast rise on the back, particularly of strong commodity prices. And Russia is a natural resource power. It's not just oil and gas. I think that it's hard to predict what will happen. I think it's naive to think that if Putin is somehow replaced, someone better will take his shoes. I think there's been a wholesale change at the top in Russia, and it's hard to see anyone taking over who changes Russia's position on Ukraine and, for instance, would agree to war reparations. And that is a really big issue for Ukraine. I mean, how do you deal with the vast destruction that Russia has meted out on Ukrainian territory?
I'm afraid we've got to leave it there. Stephanie Baker, thank you very much indeed. The book is Punishing Putin Inside the Global Economic War to Bring Down Russia, and it's out now. This is Hugo Rifkin here on Times Radio.